Everybody. Welcome to this, our final Zoom session for the unit. It's great to see so many of you. Thank you for joining. And as I said in my communication this week, I want to tackle tonight slightly differently, simply because of the complexity of this case study. And given that it also is, I think, a very good opportunity for integration of so many of the things that we've looked at over the 5 weeks. Before I continue, can I just confirm that you can all hear me? Thanks, Mark. That's great. I see the thumbs up. Good. Okay. So I really want this to be a much more interactive session tonight. And I think for us to gain value out of the Zoom session, let's use this as an opportunity for a discussion. So I'm also going to open my chat and invite you to post thoughts in there as we go. So let's use that as another opportunity for interaction. And really why I'm doing this is because by the time you submit next Tuesday night, I'm looking for you to really position yourself as the consultant to Sun Microsystems and particularly to Greg James. But you will be giving me an academic report where you will have shown that not only have you done clear analysis of what is happening here, but you will also be making recommendations based on this week's readings and based on the previous 4 weeks' readings to come up with recommendations, particularly for Greg James, but in some cases maybe for his team or for the company at Sun, or even for HS as the client. So I'm making a couple of assumptions about our discussion tonight. And the first assumption that I'm going to make is that you've actually read the case study. And I'd like to kick off by asking you to give me your evaluation of how well you think Greg James has managed and led his team up to this point. So let's start there. Let's try and get some feedback, and I'd welcome thoughts in chat. And maybe just to kick off, if we asked you to rate his performance, and if I was to say to you 1 is low and 5 is high, let's use that scale. How would you rate his performance? So maybe give me a number, 1 being low, 5 being high as a team manager. And maybe you could also tell me why you've given him that score. And so I'm welcoming all of you to give me feedback in chat, but there may be some of you who have the courage of your convictions to come onto audio. And let's start there. So who wants to kick off? Any takers? And you should all be typing something into chat just to give us your perspective and get the ball rolling. But there may be a couple of you who actually are prepared to come onto the audio and give us some feedback. Okay, so Eugene's saying he gives him a 5 out of 10. So Eugene, come onto the audio and tell us why you say that. Why have you given Greg James, what I think, if I'm a team leader, is a pretty low score? Tell us why you say that.
Hi, Andy.
Go ahead.
Yeah. My belief is that it's only halfway once he done his visits country by country that he realized that there are some discrepancies between cultures in particular and also the beliefs that he thought he had, which didn't exist.
So Eugene, what you're saying is that you feel one of the fundamental things that were not addressed was his acknowledgement of the very significant cultural differences that existed between those different localized teams. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think you're right, and I think certainly if you were giving me an analysis, Eugene, that would be a very good place to explore some of that in your analysis. So you might want to go back to some of the stuff we did in week 1 that looks at working cross-culturally. And of course, all of this, Eugene, would be overlaid by the fact that these teams are dispersed across multiple time zones. So I think definitely you're onto something there, Eugene. So that's great. Any other thoughts? Let's stick with the analysis or the evaluation of James's leadership first. So Eugene's giving him a pretty low score. How do the rest of you feel? Do you agree? Do you disagree? And if you agree or disagree, tell us why.
Andy, can you hear me? It's Colin here.
I can hear you, Colin. Go for it. Loud and clear, sir.
Okay. Yeah, my view, I agree. I don't think he did a very good job in certain aspects. One of them that stood out was because it's a global team, to have some of your team members working 8 o'clock, 8:30 at night, when you working only you're working in your window of a normal workday, I think as a team leader was a bit of an oversight and something in his own interest more so than in the company's best interest. That was just one of the things that I drew from there, and then
may I pick up on that? May I pick
sure.
up on that first one, Colin? I think that's important. So there's no doubt that working across these multiple time zones and not having a protocol to manage that is something I think that global teams will often struggle with. What recommendations, Colin, to you and the team would you have? Because you're not going to change the geography. There's no doubt about that the geography is a reality. But what recommendations would you have to fix the dynamics of what is essentially a 24/7 coverage?
Well, I think maybe what you've got to do is you've got to consult everybody and just see what the challenges are that everyone's facing in terms of times, and try and get a more of a mutual agreement on times rather than just say one team must take the brunt of it all. It just seems like the one team had to just accept that they were the ones that just had to take all the bad.
Yeah, and certainly, Colin, during the busy weeks, there were some teams that were working longer hours than others, and I think that did create some pushback, if not a degree of resistance on the part of those teams. So I think that's certainly something that Greg James couldn't change the geography, but he may well have been able to change the frequency of interaction, Colin, or when meetings were scheduled, to try and mitigate, I think, some of the impact of that asynchronous interaction that they were working with. Would you agree?
I agree, yes.
Yeah, good point. So Eugene's spoken about culture, and Colin's spoken about time and technology. What other things do we see coming out in terms of evaluating James's management? Anything else that struck you? Because, you know, with a case study, the more detailed analysis you can do, and the more in-depth root cause analysis you can perform, the stronger your recommendations are going to be. So this is why I'm spending some time on this. I'm really looking for you to dig deep into what you see here. And that's why in the invitation, you know, I'm asking you to think about the challenges of a dispersed team. I'm asking you to think about some of the things that Eugene highlighted, which were the tensions of cross-culture. And Colin's also impacted, or, you know, referred to this impact of time and technology. Anything else that you want to highlight in terms of his management, you know, positive or negative?
Can I add another one to that?
Please do, Colin. Go for it.
The conflict avoidance between the two team leaders below him, two of his subordinates, where there was an unconscious bias of not liking the one race for whatever reason, and
right.
There was nothing done about it.
Right. And Colin, this makes me think back to Lencioni with the model we did on Saturday in terms of the 5 dysfunctions of a team. Right at the bottom there is the absence of conflict. And so what we know is that sometimes you've actually got to provoke a degree of open disagreement among team members so that the task-based conflict can really impact on performance. So it's not attacking the individual, it's being hard on the issue and soft on the person, and it's creating a forum where you're openly discussing those differences of opinion to try and leverage those differences and come up with some kind of commonality. What you're suggesting, Colin, I think, is that conflict was not managed or mitigated in a way that was effective, I think. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Great. So that's good. Excellent. Any other thoughts on the analysis? I think we've started to touch on some areas, and I would hope in going back to the question just while you're thinking about that. The question says, identify to what extent Greg James's difficulties have been caused by the following factors. So I kind of point you in a direction: culture, organizational structure or processes, organizational change, his leadership style. So, I would expect you, certainly early on in the piece, to do some degree of analysis in the order of what we're doing now, and show me, yes, there was an issue with the customer, but that was really only an effect of deeper underlying issues which could be attributed to one or more of those factors. So before we come out of that, let me ask if there are any other observations in terms of root cause analysis that anybody wants to highlight, because it really is a fascinating case study, and I can tell you, working in this, I'm getting some feedback from somewhere. Maybe you, Bussy. Just hold on, Bussy. Yes. Just go on mute for us. Yeah, can you just mute for a moment, Bussy, while I finish this point, and then we'll open to you. Thank you. I can say it with confidence, team, that certainly working in this area of globally diverse firms and virtual teams, that the case study is rich in terms of highlighting many of the complexities that we find. Bussy, let's come to you now. I don't know that your audio is great, but I'm going to go quiet and listen to you. Go ahead.
I'll try. Andrew, one thing that I also noticed is that his leadership style. He was doing everything himself. He was not delegating until he decided to delegate to some of the team leaders. Then things started to improve.
I think you're onto something there, Bussy, and maybe if I could press you, what do you think might be the reason for him being reluctant, possibly, to delegate to his team members?
I think at the beginning, he thought because he's managing them at a distance, he'll be able to handle everything himself. And also, he did not trust their level of capabilities.
So you've actually given me the key concept, Bussy, and I'm going to ask you to go on mute now because of the quality of your audio. But I'm not sure if you heard what Bussy said, but she referenced the whole construct around trust. So I would expect that somewhere in your analysis, you would talk to me about the fact that there's an over-reliance on asynchronous technology. You would talk about the fact that the trust dynamic in the virtual team is critical, and I think Bussy hits the nail on the head when she says that was probably lacking, and that without actually being able to physically visit those remote sites, the team members lost the opportunity to learn from each other. So I think there was a lack of trust between the offices, and they're probably, if what Bussy is saying is true, and James is unwilling or unable or reluctant to delegate, that may also talk to a deeper root cause of a lack of trust on his part, which was exacerbated by the fact that these teams are not co-located. So good one, Bussy. I think that's excellent. Okay, I'm going to stop there and say, I think you've got a flavor, I hope, in that 15-minute discussion of the kind of thing that I would want you to talk about in your analysis. So we know that things crashed and burned with the server, with the customer. We know that. What we're trying to understand is what were the drivers behind that at a leadership and a virtual team level. Now, one of the things that I've given you in the agenda, in the analysis agenda from yesterday, is something that comes from Tsedal Neely. It was in the October 2015 issue of the Harvard magazine. And Tsedal uses this little framework, which I think is brilliant, called SPLIT. And you know, when you're doing a case study, if you can have some tools to be able to do an analysis, that can really help. So in your analysis or in your recommendations, either, you might want to consider how the team has been configured structurally. That's the S. You might want to think about process. And I think there, Busi's already touched on the leadership behaviors or lack of leadership. Language, so lots of miscommunication, misunderstanding, ambiguity could be a language issue. Identity, how does the team see themselves? Is there a contributing factor of isolation? And of course, technology. Are they using, you know, the fact that you've got France, India, UAE, US, there's a heavy reliance on computer-mediated technology, but they seem to be using a lot of asynchronous in their approach. So it could be, again, it's a suggestion. If I was going to answer this paper, I might choose to use the SPLIT framework for the analysis. I might choose to use the SPLIT framework for the recommendations. I might choose to use the SPLIT framework for both. You don't have to use it, but it's a really neat way of taking a very complex swathe of concepts and ideas and trying to make sense, because ultimately when you get to the recommendations, your recommendations are going to need to be source-based. They're going to need to be clearly articulated. And for every issue that you identify as a problem, you know, anybody can raise issues, anybody can identify problems, but if you're acting as the consultant in managing the globally diverse firm, every issue that you raise needs to be mitigated with a very strong resource-based recommendation. So let's move on to those, unless anybody's got anything else they want to talk about in terms of the analysis. We could spend hours doing the analysis, and I've got literally pages and pages of notes that I've made. But I'm trying to tonight just give you a flavor of how I'm expecting you to start tackling the case study. So if you're happy for me to move on to recommendations, can you just give me an indication, yes, or give me a note in chat or a thumbs up or something?
Yes. Move
Thank
on.
you. Thanks, Busi. That's great. Good. Okay. So I'm going to make an assumption that you've done a very thorough diagnosis and analysis using the SPLIT framework, or talking about asynchronous or cross-cultural tensions that Eugene mentioned. Now it comes to recommendations. And if you go back to the question, it says using any of the readings. So team, I want to emphasize this, and you will see the note that I sent out in the week. A number of you are clearly highly experienced professional leaders in your own right. And I'm not negating that fact at all. But remember, the unit is strongly based in a theoretical set of resources. So I'm expecting you, when you make a recommendation, to substantiate that from the readings. And the only difference this week is you're not limited to this week's readings. You can go back to week 1. If there's something there around culture, or if there's something there around conflict, or if there's something there around the team dynamics that we looked at, that you can draw on to substantiate your recommendations, please do that, number 1. Number 2, do that in reference in text. Number 3, do it with page numbers. So I'm going to start becoming a lot stricter on you now, where in the past, if you reference the text, that was enough. But I now want to know, where are you getting this from, so that if I was to go and look on that page of the article or the journal or the whatever, I would find the source. And that's why it says, be sure to identify what problems will be fixed by each of your recommendations, and critically, you must include references. So it's important when you come to the recommendations that you think about recommendations. And notice that I've asked you recommendations for Greg James, but I would not be unhappy if in your answer you also had recommendations for his team, you had recommendations for HS Holdings, you may even have recommendations for Greg's boss. I'm happy for you to take this as holistically as you want to. But the key thing is, and this is where I'm going to be really tough on you, is you've got to substantiate what you're telling me from the sources that I've given you. And that's going to be really important. So let me throw it back to the group. What, if any, do you think are the recommendations that you would give? The problem with HS, the problem with the client has happened. That server has crashed. Going forward now, I think we want to do two things. We want to address the immediate problem of the lack of service delivery to the customer, but we also want to address a mitigation plan to ensure that it doesn't happen again. So I almost would want you to think about the recommendations as, this is what I need to put in place now as a fire break so that we can address the immediate problem. But let's also think about some medium to long-term recommendations so that Greg can actually address these things on a more sustainable basis. So framing it in that way, let me hand it back to the group and ask you to give me your thoughts. Any suggestions? So we've judged him pretty harshly. Eugene gave him a 5 out of 10. I think Mark supported that recommendation, and others. So now we want to say, okay, we're not going to fire the guy. We've got to work with him. How do you want him to handle this in the immediate short term? And what do you think can be done, in terms of improving his team and improving his leadership? Any suggestions? And I'm not expecting you to reference the suggestions now. We can talk, very freely. But when you write the paper, I want you to be able to substantiate your answer. So please don't feel that I'm going to ask you right now to say, where do you get that from in the text? We're having a discussion, but obviously when you submit the assignment, you're going to substantiate that. Yeah, and I think, Colin, Colin's asking about part B of the article. And yes, in many cases, there are suggestions in there, Colin, but I'm looking for you to build on that and to really give me, your own thoughts. So part B is helping you, but I want you to build on that and really develop whatever is given there. So I want to see that you can take some of the principles. Yeah, I can hear you. Who's that? Is that you, Busi?
It's Busi, but I know my network is bad. Yes. The recommendations that I would do if I was the boss of Greg, first was to check if really Greg is competent to be able to handle the situation, like the coaching. I mean, maybe to be coached on how to address this issue as quickly as possible.
Okay. Okay, so you would want to put some sort of coaching intervention in place with who, Busi? Coaching for James? Coaching for his team? What would that look like?
Coaching for him as a leader himself.
Okay.
Because I don't see how he can lead the team. He himself is not competent or doesn't understand the impacts of managing the visual team.
Okay.
We feel that was the challenge, that he had done this, and maybe even the training that he got didn't put him on the level, be aware that gonna face all those challenges.
Okay. Okay, and so if you say coaching, Busi, remember, I think there may be validity in that. In your piece, in your submission, I then want you to go and look for something that would substantiate that and give me a little bit more, I think evidence around what that might look like. But I think you may be onto something there. So coaching, I'm saying yes. I think that I think there may be something, but you would need to be more specific, Busi, around what the nature of the coaching would be. Would it be coaching around cross culture? Would it be coaching on leadership? Would it be coaching on team dynamics? Would it be coaching on how to handle conflict? So getting more specific, I think, is what I'm suggesting. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. Thanks.
Great. Okay, any other thoughts, team? Any other thoughts on recommendations?
Andy, can I come in there?
Please do, Eugene.
Hello?
Yep.
Probably one of the key benefits of managing a global team that Greg needs to look at as well is your cultural diversity. Maybe increase creativity amongst his team, seeing that his team is quite dispersed around the globe. Those are all the things that you could look at to maybe also source a pool of proper talent and mix them accordingly. Looking at the challenges they had in Pakistan, and I think that's UAE not willing to work together. You could leverage on opportunities in there and look at how can you merge those teams as well.
You see, Eugene, I think you're onto something there. I think that we would not be able to address this issue correctly or holistically without including recommendations on James, at least probably spending some time in these different cultures, Eugene, and in some way unlocking the opportunity for greater dynamic interaction between, for example, the French team and the UAE, and maybe even, Eugene, some cultural intelligence workshops where, like what we did on the first week, thinking around relating, regulating, reasoning, how we manage ourselves and others, and the differences in worldview and unconscious bias. That, in fact, may be something that would help for people to be more, can we say, forgiving of each other, because if you don't understand the fact that people in other parts of the world work differently, it's going to continue to be a source of frustration in the team. So I think you're onto something there. And that may mean, Eugene, that the way he manages his team meetings, the frequency of those team meetings and what's covered in those team meetings might actually need to change and have a very strong cross-cultural element in them. So I think you're onto something there, absolutely. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, Andrew, how are you?
I'm well, and you, Itumeleng?
Good, thank you. I think one other thing that I would do in terms of that is, if you read through that, especially from the beginning of the case study, you can see there's a lot of blaming and a lot of blame shifting that's happening, exactly. which is a key element for like I would do in terms of that was take to on trust. I know there's a lot of courses, and one of the formulas that's about trust is that if in a high trust environment, they talk about speed is high and cost is low. So definitely taking the whole team and taking them for like trust workshops in terms of them working together. And it will eliminate a lot of the issues that they talk about. For example, the French saying that the US are getting paid more and stuff like that. All of those are just elements of low trust in those environments.
So, Itumeleng, I definitely agree with you. And I know you and I had a brief discussion last weekend about Stephen R. Covey's The Speed of Trust. And I think you said to me your organization has been doing some work around that. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. And so for the benefit of the rest of the group, The Speed of Trust is a brilliant piece of work done by Stephen R. Covey. This is the same Covey family who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This is his son, Stephen R. Covey. And what Itumeleng's talking about is the fact that there's the trust of competence, the trust of contract. I think we spoke about some of these in one of the weeks, the trust of intentions. And what you're saying, Itumeleng, is before you do anything, before you get into technology or processes or team dynamics, you want to actually take the guys through what I'm assuming, Itumeleng, would be an on-site, face-to-face exposure to trust and how trust works. Is that right?
Yes, correct, yeah, definitely.
I think that's very powerful. And certainly, as I referenced on Saturday, that whole concept of virtual trust is in many ways a paradox. So the further away we are from each other, Itumeleng, the less likely we are to trust each other. But the further away we are from each other, the more we need to trust each other. So I think the trust piece would probably need to be foundational in Itumeleng. In other words, you can address the structure, you can address identity and cohesion and technology, but I think fundamentally you're onto something there in terms of the trust dynamics. And so recommendations on how we address trust in a virtual context, I think, Itumeleng, if you went down that road in your assignment and you were to make recommendations around that, in a way, I would almost argue that that's probably fundamental. You know, if that's not addressed, then anything else we do, I think, is going to be secondary. So that's a very, very good point. Well done. Anything else, team? I'm conscious that we're half an hour in. Mark, I see your raised hand, and if you want to come off mute, please go ahead, sir.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There we go. Yep. I can hear you loud and clear. Let me just turn my volume up. Go for it.
Itumeleng is on the right path because you can also reference. I think I read somewhere in the book there was an example. I think it was a Japanese company where the
Mark, I'm struggling to hear you. I noticed that you don't have a headset, so the audio is a little low. Is there any way you can just turn up your headset or your computer mic, because I sense you're going to say something valuable, but we're struggling to hear you. Mark's just adjusting his headset. While he's doing that, is there anybody else who wants to comment, just as we give Mark a couple of seconds to adjust his hardware?
Testing 1 2. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Mark, I can hear you now. Go for it, buddy. So you were saying, I heard you say something like Itumeleng's on the right track, and then I lost you.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear. Much better. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah, he's on the right track because I can't actually remember where did I read it. I think it's in the textbook. It was a company. I think it's a Japanese company where they'll only want to do business with you if you then visit their production factory.
Yeah.
And when you visit it, and because for them, you need to actually see how their staff are operating and the culture within the organization, understand where they're coming from, how's it been produced, and then only they will then consider doing business with you because you then understand where they're coming from. Yeah.
So, Mark, you're suggesting that James might need to do more site visits more regularly? Is that what I'm concluding from what you're suggesting?
Yeah, if he can then keep his ears on the ground and know exactly what the people, where they come from, what their cultures are like. Actually, I'm also talking from experience because, I visited certain countries where we did business, and I actually found that, in terms of the culture, it's very different. Like I mentioned in one of my assignments as well, I was actually quite surprised that for an ordinary worker to keep greeting our bosses, if I can say manager or even the CEO, address them as sir. We call them by the first name. But a simple thing like that, where if you go to some of these countries where they address everybody as madam and sir, and you got to then adjust to that particular culture, you see. And yeah, that's what I've got to say about that.
So Mark, I think you raise a very interesting dynamic. One of the things that I said in preparation for tonight was place yourself in the role of Greg James place yourself in the role of AHS Holdings and also consider the perspective of James's team. Now, Mark makes an interesting point. If I'm sitting in India, culturally, I may have a very different view of the world and a very different view of what's happening in terms of this issue than if I'm viewing this from, say, the UAE. And my response to the issue, my degree of ownership of the issue, my willingness to speak up to the issue, my ability to be explicit about what I see as the issue, and even my willingness to tell you when I see something wrong, is not necessarily going to be universally consistent across those cultures. And I think, Mark, you're right that it may be important to understand the protocol of how that manager-leader or leader-follower relationship works. India more hierarchical, probably the same in the UAE, a greater willingness to take on a leader in a Western culture, French seeing things in a much more complex way, the US wanting to reduce things to its most simple components. So I think, Mark, what you're saying is that we've got to also understand not just the cross-cultural dynamics, but also how people on the ground in those individual locations work and interact with each other, and how even that degree of hierarchy could impact on my willingness to raise issues or to flag concerns or even to express disagreement. I think that's what I'm hearing from you, Mark.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, if you want to get the best out of people, for argument's sake, certain people they might consider rewards, for argument's sake, where we might see it as a bribe, they might see it as as an achievement that yes, they deserve to actually get that kind of
right.
Of
so Mark, you're taking us down another route, and that reminds me, way back when, I know it seems like a long time ago, but in week 2, you might remember we did a whole thing around motivation. And Mark, what you're saying is it may even be important to recognize that different cultures are going to accept or reject reward or acknowledgement or praise or criticism differently. And so James would also need to be careful about having a one-size-fits-all approach. He has to be seen to be fair, but he also has to be seen to be culturally specific in his acknowledgement of performance, Mark.
Sure. Like for us in South Africa, we may be driven by maybe working 8 hours. But I can tell you for a fact, when I worked in India, people are working in excess of 12 hours, and that's like normal for them. So where I then find it difficult maybe to work past my 8 hours, they are well willing to work the 12 hours, and that for them is normal. See, so taking all those into consideration, that's what he needs to do as a global leader.
Yeah. And maybe, team, on that point, and again, I know those of you who are much more process-driven are going to say, but Andy, this is going all over the place. Yeah, well, welcome to case studies. There's no formula. But one of the things you might want to do is maybe take the split framework and draw up kind of a table of pluses and minuses for each. So if we take Sun Microsystems and we look at the structure of the dispersed teams, what are the pluses and minuses? If we look at the processes, which is the leadership behavior and interaction over time zones, pluses and minuses. If we look at language, pluses and minuses. So when you do that, it gives you a very systematic approach to do your root cause analysis. And it probably also gives you a very systematic approach to your recommendations. One of the things that we've not really spoken about is this idea of virtual teams and this quote unquote open work environment. So this idea where people are working remotely, people are not all in the center. I know some of you raised the whole IBM issue this week of how they're now trying to centralize everything again. So it might also be worth just taking a step back and saying, in the dynamic of working in remote offices, what are the pluses and minuses? So structurally, it may be a bigger picture of, you might have a particularly strong view on the positives of virtual teams, and some of you might have some very negative views on virtual teams. It's not my job to convince you either way. All we're saying is that for many businesses, they're a reality. But in your analysis, it may even be important for you just to say, I think fundamentally there is a problem with this quote unquote open work environment, where on the one hand it saves costs, it reduces travel, it meets the complexities of modern work, but on the other hand, it means that everything is still quite US centric. The infrastructures are different. The technologies are different, and you lack the face-to-face contact. So that may even be kind of your opening parlance to this thing, to say, actually fundamentally there's a problem in the way this whole business is set up. And again, if you want to argue that point, I'm very happy for you to do that, as long as you can substantiate your position. Okay. I'm conscious we've been going about 40 minutes. I know this is longer than normal, but given the complexity of the case study, I wanted to give it sufficient time and rigor. So let me conclude then by asking any questions or reflections or insights from your side that you want to raise pertaining to the Sun Microsystems case study.
Yes, Andrew, maybe a stupid question here, but
Go
I just
ahead.
wanted to find out, obviously, this is a very long case study and so forth. What's the guideline in terms of word count?
So there is a guideline. The guideline is still 800 to 1,000 words. And that means you're going to have to work hard to take a lot of information, and even our discussion tonight, and really try and condense it into those 1,000 words. And I think at Itumeleng, that's important. There would always be the temptation to go into a long diatribe on both the analysis and the recommendations. So the skill here, the skill here is to be able to do your analysis in 250, 300 words, and paint that picture. So it's not more than a page of root cause analysis. And then the balance of the thing, you actually need to give me clear, source-based recommendations. So I'm not looking for you to extend the word count, and I'm certainly not going to give you a larger word count. Part of the skill is to be able to integrate many of these things into a solid, tight 1,000-word piece. So it's going to end up being sort of 4 type pages, excluding the references. Hope that helps you, Itumeleng. Any other questions, team? Has the discussion been helpful? Has it at least given you an angle of attack into this thing? Because Itumeleng's point is the valid one. It's a complex case. It's an in-depth case. There's lots of detail, and you've got to try and sift through all of this and make sense of the complexity and come up with recommendations on the back of 5 weeks of managing globally diverse firms. So I hope this Zoom session has helped to at least give you.
Yes, thanks. It has helped.
Good. That's
great.
great.
It has helped a lot.
Good. Okay. Are there any other questions? A lot of you've got cameras on, so I can see you nodding or shaking your heads. A lot of you don't, so I'm not sure whether this is clear or not. And so I'm going to just give one final round opportunity. Yes, go ahead.
Can I ask you a question?
Of course you can.
Okay. Yeah, if I can put you in the situation of boss, of Greg.
Yep. Greg's
what
boss. Greg's boss?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm a 5 out of 10. How would you, because it actually reflects bad on you as well, how would you then get me motivated in order for me to be an 8 or maybe 9?
Yeah, and it's a great question, Mark. And in a way, I want to dodge the question because I'm hoping that some of you who are in that in that higher grade range are going to tell me that. But let me say this. I think fundamentally, if you look at how this case study starts, there is definitely a challenge in the relationship between James and Spurlock, I think is the name of his boss. Relationship, trust, coaching, sensitization. I don't know that there is a sense of I have your back. And I think fundamentally it's very easy for this guy to turn around and blame James. But Mark, I think you hit the nail on the head that in many cases, James's inadequacies are reflected or reflect poorly in his boss's leadership as well. So it's very easy just to push downwards and blame him. But it makes me wonder that there may be things from his point of view that I think are important. I know I haven't answered your question, Mark, because it's not my job in the case study to give you the answers. But let me say that I think you would be onto something if you were to make reference to that. And Lavoyo makes a brilliant point that if you thought the other two units were tough, this is tricky, Lavoyo. And of course, there's no, if you're looking for the model answer, there isn't one, because that's the challenge of managing the globally diverse firm. But all I would say, Lavoyo, is if you follow the methodology and the approach, and you use many of the richness of the resources that we've looked at over the last 5 weeks, it should at least give you a clue on how to look at this through a particular set of glasses in a way that I would hope you are more equipped for than you would have been in week one. But you're right. It's messy. Leadership is messy, and it's difficult to tie up all the loose ends in a way that, say, a finance course would give you a single calculation at the end. And I know for many people that's frustrating. But we're working with human beings, right? Okay, any other thoughts, team? I'm conscious that it's almost coming up to 10 to the hour. Please go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Lavoyo.
I just want to say thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's why my comment was like, I really thought the calculations were difficult, but yeah, definitely. This was kind of a very tricky kind of analysis and all that. But anyway, thank you very much. I'm sure some of us won't see you again. But
yeah, that's really my pleasure, Lavoyo. I'm glad. And I thought tonight if we made use of this technology, it would also be great because we're doing it virtually, and it gives you a flavor of what if you were Greg James, the manager, this is the kind of thing he'd be doing once a week across multiple time zones. So I intentionally I didn't want us to do the case study in the class. I wanted us to do it in this format because I wanted you to get a flavor of the complexity as well. Brilliant. Well, team, again, as I said on Saturday, I want to thank all of you. As much as you may or may not have learned something, I've learned a fair amount from interacting with all of you over the last 5 weeks. Thank you for hanging in there. Thank you to those of you who were consistent, not just in your attendance, but in your submissions and in the quality of those submissions. I trust that we will keep in touch. Our agreement then is you will meet your deadlines for tomorrow as per the course program, but that this assignment will be submitted on Tuesday. I will then spend the balance of next week just going through your final grades. I will then get those moderated. And I think based on what Corneille said to me, just so that you know, my Board of Examiners meeting, I think is the 11th of August. Let me just check that. Because of course you know that the final grades are released once they've been moderated. Let me just see that because she sent me a meeting request today. Yeah, 11th of August is when the grades are, the board of examiners sit. So I have to go and defend my case in terms of your marks. And although you will obviously have access to your grade book before that, 11th of August is when the final grades will be released. So thank you very much to all of you. I want to wish you a good evening and every success as you continue going forward. Itumeleng, final word to you, sir.
Yes, again, thank you for a great 5 weeks. It was very, I learned quite a lot, implemented quite a lot of stuff in my team as well.
Good.
I just wanted to understand something. I see on, I don't know if everyone has that problem, but I see on the grade book, week 4 assignment, the mark. But
so I'm losing you, Itumeleng. Grade book week 4 assignment. Go ahead. Say
yeah,
it again.
the mark was previously there, but it's not there anymore.
Right. I will go into the grade book and I will check. It could have been in my update today. I did have some late submissions, and so it's possible that in me entering those that it's removed that grade. But I will look at that tomorrow and we'll make sure that it's visible for you. Thank you. All right, everybody. Have a great evening and all the best. Ciao, ciao. Bye bye.
Ciao. Bye.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thanks a lot.